Hey, Patricia.
Hello, Kim.
How was your weekend?
My weekend was okay. Was just resting because last week we had an opening. We just opened the second of our MFA thesis exhibitions. This one is titled Substitute Reality. And I really enjoyed the works of our MFA students. I'm always very impressed by what they bring and the level of sophistication that they bring, even at this early point in their careers. So I was just taking a break from that. But how about you?
Oh, it was fun. It was oddly, remarkably hot here in LA. And the LA Forum for Design and Architecture organized a tour of the Metro art stations. So we started at Expo Crenshaw with Rebecca Mendez, who did this incredible mosaic installation, and then Jamie Scholnick, who did these porcelain enamel panels in the downstairs where the trains are. And then we went over to Shinique Smith's station, where she had this absolutely blow your mind incredible mosaic wall. And then we got to my station, and I have to say, following up Shanique is tough. She's a rock star. She just knows how to do this so well. She knows how to bring the audience up to speed. Yeah,
Nice.
It's a whole skill. And I was just sort of oh, Shanique's brilliant. And then I was oh, and my station. Oh, right, I have to be on now. So that was kind of a funny thing. But it was fun. And then we ended with Kentura's station, which was absolutely just blow your mind incredible, and she did just an incredible project. So it was one of those things that if you're in LA and you're taking the train, be sure to step out and check out the art, because each station has really powerfully strong projects.
Oh, wow. That is exciting. Yeah, I never take the train, but I know a lot of people do. So, yeah, that's so great. I love it.
Yeah, it was fun. Okay, well, we have a special guest today. Shall we get on with it?
Yes, please.
Welcome to The Art Equation.
Welcome to The Art Equation, a podcast from Now Be Here. I'm one of your hosts, Patricia Ortega, and our historian and independent curator.
I'm your other host, Kim Schoenstadt, a contemporary artist and organizer of Now Be Here, a directory of and for women and non-binary artists.
On this podcast, we have a little charla, a little bachipapo about making art and making exhibitions. We invite fellow artists, curators, archivists, and people from different areas of the art world to share their knowledge and their experience.
We are curious about what goes on in the day-to-day of arting. We want to talk shop, get in the weeds about what goes into art shows, talk with the makers and the doers of the art world. Welcome to The Art Equation. For this episode, we're revisiting a theme that we've touched on in the past. A part of our ongoing art and tech series that we do on this podcast, we've invited artist Nancy Baker Cahill to speak with us today. Nancy, welcome to The Art Equation. We're so happy to have you.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes, we are thrilled. Before we get started, we are going to read a biography as usual, so our listeners can get to know you and your work before jumping into some juicy conversation.
All right, here we go. Nancy Baker Cahill is a transdisciplinary artist and expanded filmmaker with a research-based practice. Her work examines complex systems with an emphasis on the relationship between consciousness, intelligence, and embodiment. Systems thinking plays an important role in her practice. She is primarily concerned with power and its biopolitical impacts, particularly ecological and social harms. Using a blend of analog and digital media, Nancy creates immersive experiences, video installations, sculptures, and conceptual projects that engage the human sensorium and are rooted in drawing. Since 2018, she has been the founder and artistic director of Fourth Wall, a free augmented reality (AR) public art platform exploring resistance and inclusive creative expressions. Her monumental AR artworks build on the lineage of ecofeminist land art, often highlighting interdependencies and the more than human. She takes a critical approach to all of the emerging technologies she uses, subverting convention to offer alternative imaginaries. Her work has been profiled in publications including the Art Newspaper, Frieze, and the New York Times, among others. Her essay appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Namjoon Pike Art Center Reader, and October Magazine. Nancy is an artist, scholar, alumnus of the Bruggen Institute and a TEDx speaker. In 2021, she was awarded the Williams College Bicentennial Medal of Honor and a COLA Master of Arts Fellowship. She is a 2022 LACMA and Art Plus Tech grant recipient, winner of the 2024 Infinity Festival's Monolith Award for New Media Fine Art, and is an affiliate of the Harvard Meta Lab. Her work is held in so many collecting institutions. We whittled it down a little bit. Here we go. The Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, the Georgia Museum of Art in Georgia, Smart Museum Collection Chicago, RFC Art Collection Miami, the Winthrop University Collection South Carolina, and the Hex Collection in Prague, Czechoslovakia. Wow,
Whew.
Nancy.
Wow.
Wow.
We need a whole encyclopedia
Yeah.
and dictionary for Nancy.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so now we know a lot, right? But can we back it up and just start real far? Where did you grow up? How did you end up in LA?
I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, and I ended up in LA. I got married very young when I was 24, and my then husband was an aspiring TV writer, and we moved out to Los Angeles. So actually, Los Angeles is the only other city I've lived in up to this point other than Boston.
Oh,
Interesting.
okay.
And that was a long time ago.
Right, so you've seen this city evolve, too.
Oh, I have really seen the city evolve. And when we got here in 95, it was a totally different place. The earthquake, I think, had just happened. The Rodney King
Uprising
had also happened. So it felt like the city was in recovery, basically. And it was actually a relatively easy place. There was rent control. It was a relatively easy place to survive on very little. And that, of course, has changed dramatically.
I remember my 2-bedroom apartment in Pasadena was $800.
Yes, ours in West Hollywood was $900.
Wow.
Yeah, impossible to imagine now.
No.
And now it is a recovery time. Again, it feels like, right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
We want to know, how did you get into art? When did you start making art? And what did that journey look like for you?
That's a really beautiful question. I've always been an artist. I've made art, my entire life. However, I majored in art as an undergraduate, and I was also an activist. And at the time, I sort of thought I had grandiose visions of, this is going to sound totally megalomaniacal. I could single-handedly revolutionize the media. That was my goal. I thought that was somehow within reach. And of course, it took me about a few hours to realize that was absurd. And I started my career actually in public television as a writer, writing descriptive narration for the blind and visually impaired. And I actually think in many ways that created a certain foundation for my practice today, which is to say, it really became obvious to me immediately that making cultural products, art, accessible to the broadest possible audience was not just the mandate of that particular public television station, but something to aspire to more generally and broadly. And I moved out here again right after that, and I would say candidly, I was intimidated. Boston's a very somewhat provincial place, and LA was, just for me anyway, presented a kind of culture shock that took me a long time to adjust to. And I had big goals of starting my practice when I got here. And I really felt, that I didn't have community. I didn't have a sense of purpose. And then I had my first child, and that just took me on a different path. My daughter had a number of health concerns, and that occupied most of my attention. So I didn't really get back to an art practice in earnest until about a decade later, when I'd had my third child, and I realized as much as I enjoyed and adore and would do anything for my children, I was not doing the thing that I had always dreamed of. And so it was then that I returned to a practice. But of course, by the time I returned to my practice, all of the tools I'd used, particularly in the video sphere as an undergraduate, were completely obsolete. And I didn't go to graduate school, so I didn't have particularly like a built-in community or support network. So I really had to build out my practice slowly and brick by brick. And that was very formative as well.
Yeah, we have that in common, right?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, I didn't go to graduate school either. I just worked for an artist.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And you do, like the cohort that you're in school with generally is your support system when you get out. And so, we do have to do it on our own. But one thing you said that I wanted to kind of dip back into was that, do you feel like your early work in caption writing helped you be a better writer of artist statements?
What a great question. Absolutely. I have to say that when you are, and this is where constraints really can hone any type of discipline or practice. So we had to write narration in the interstices, the gaps in between either sound effects or narration. So you had, as a rule, to be pithy. You rarely had an unbroken, like a minute would be an eternity. So if it were like a nature program, you might have that time. But generally in writing narration for dramas, you had to describe, what was happening in the most concise way possible. And what it did is it forced you to prioritize, which for me, as someone without like great executive function, posed a really important challenge, which is to say, what is most urgent to express? What is most urgent to communicate in these gaps for the listener, the viewer? And that definitely, over time, took what was very sort of flowery and I assume pretentious writing and turned it into something much leaner and meaner. And for that, I am eternally grateful.
It sounds like this experience also put you into a deeper connection with what you call the sensorium, right? The senses, this sort of sensorial experience that you're interested in. And I was just going to bring the question about this journey of going from drawing to the use of augmented reality or more advanced technology of today. What's the value for you of working on this intersection between this traditional medium and these newer technologies?
Well, first of all, no one has ever made that connection before, and I so appreciate it because even I hadn't thought of it. But it makes perfect sense that when and I think the sensorium is a whole other conversation we could have, and where the inherent value is in not privileging one over the other, but to kind of engage as many as possible. And that's something that, certainly in modernity, but particularly with the advent of these advanced technologies and the little black mirrors that we carry around in our pockets, has in many ways muted and dulled certain sensitivities that I think are critical to engaging intentionally and thoughtfully with the natural world. So I want to just say that from the outset. But the way that AR and drawing really came together was, I tend to pinpoint it to the moment I started working in virtual reality, which is distinct. I mean, a lot of people conflate the two, and they actually are quite different. Virtual reality requires a headset to experience. If it's mixed reality, it really is mixed. But generally, if it's a straightforward VR experience, it is contained. Whereas augmented reality does not require a headset. It does require the visual prosthesis of a phone or a tablet to provide that intermediating digital layer over physical space as we experience it. So I normally, when asked this question, tend to just go back as far as a lot of immersive drawings I was doing, and I was frustrated because they were very biomorphic and people were having incredibly visceral and embodied reactions to them, which of course for me was catnip. I thought, oh, how do I amplify that? How do I turn this up to 11? And it was a curator, it was actually Carol Ann, who said, well, why don't you just make these in VR? If that's what you want to do, why don't you make them in VR? And that was a pivotal moment in my development as an artist. But I will say, prior to that, when I look back, I had been trying to make immersive experiences with drawing from the beginning. So, I won't bore everybody with the details, but I made an immersive video of myself drawing, wearing a wig made of my own drawings, and then using very rudimentary After Effects, having my own body in the video eclipsed by one of my drawings. I mean, I was sort of stabbing at an idea clumsily from different perspectives and sort of not quite getting it. But when I look back and, I did an immersive exhibition at the now defunct Pasadena Museum of California Art, same thing, trying to put the body into something that was drawn or shaped by the hand. Again, it wasn't perfect, but I was adverting toward it. And it wasn't until I got my hands on VR software that I realized, like, oh my God, this is an ecstatic expression. And I mean ecstatic almost in a religious sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, you just said VR software, but you're using virtual reality software for augmented reality.
So thank you for making that clarification. So when I first began working, all of my drawings were exclusively in VR because I wanted people to be able to walk through the drawings and to move through them led by their own curiosity or instincts. The inevitable outcome is that you realize there's a huge barrier to entry, and that barrier to entry is the hardware itself. It's just not something people commonly have, but also, I've tried exhibiting it in a number of different contexts, and you have to wait in line, and you have to put something on your face that maybe you're not that psyched to put on your face after the person before you. There are all these points of friction. And it was then that this really kind of landed with me, that I went to my then developers and I said, hey, I really, really want to make this more accessible. These experiences, I want to share these with a broader audience. What can we do? What can we do to make this less frictive? And they said, well, we just put it in AR. I mean, of course, I was aware of AR. There's a beautiful, long and storied history of AR and AR experimentation up to that point. This was in 2017. And they said, well, why don't we develop an app? And this way we can translate your VR drawings into AR. And that was, again, one of these kind of seminal moments where I realized, I wanted to do the app for a number of different reasons that were related to gatekeeping, that were related to accessibility, that were related to who gets to define what public art is, how it's experienced, where it's experienced. But I thought, well, if we could translate these VR drawings into AR drawings, then this unknown, unseen audience could create context and content. Using these assets just almost as a prompt, almost as a spark, they could situate these in the settings of their choices and do all kinds of narrative, imaginative things with them. And of course, that's exactly what they did. So it was mind-blowing from the beginning. It was this kind of collaboration with an audience that I didn't know.
First, I do want to do a little housekeeping. You mentioned Carol Ann. That's Carol Ann Clonarides.
Yes.
And she was a curator, and she is still a curator.
Yes.
But she is independent from institutions now, and she does independent projects. But moreover, she is a wickedly good studio visit.
Oh, God. Yes.
Like one of those just magical studio visits, like what happened to you. And there are these curators in the art world who come in and they do this.
And they zero in on the thing that you can't see, but they can. Yeah. And it changed the course of my practice and my life.
I think she's done that for a few people.
Yeah, I'm just eternally grateful.
Thanks, Carol Ann.
Yes, thank you.
But I wanted to get back to the app, because in order for all of the augmented reality stuff to happen, you did have a technological barrier.
Yes.
Because how do we get it onto this phone that I'm waving around, and how does that become a portal?
So I am not a coder. I wish I were a coder. I've always said that if I could live my life again, I would want to be trained as a coder, because I'd be a hacker. I'd be a hacker over an artist any day. But anyway, I had to work with a team. I had to work with the development team. At the time, it was Drive Studios. They obviously understood how to translate these digital assets from one particular iteration to another. It's been an ongoing journey. Even today, with my new developer, Shaking Earth Digital, we are constantly optimizing, constantly adapting, constantly adjusting every time there is an app update and everything breaks, having to rebuild it. It is an ongoing project. It's really almost in many ways like a second practice in and of itself. And of course, it was really important to me from the beginning, back to my origin story, of making this free, making it accessible. And we can get into the complications of working with these technologies and what it means on a kind of ecological level, what it means socially, particularly now with the surveillance industrial complex. How do you work with technologies responsibly and thoughtfully and critically, given all the things? But just on a sort of base level, it was really important to me that it be free and something that anyone with access to a phone or a tablet could participate in.
Which is what brings me back to this interest I have in your use of paper in your work. Because I see that there is a connection between this need that you have to intervene, the way that we use these technologies, the way that this technology is somewhat use us, right? Tell us about paper. Tell us about this value and power of paper, and perhaps then we can talk about drawing as this sort of broader question you have about conceptualizing paper and drawing.
Oh, I love that. And I could nerd out on paper, and I know you can too.
Oh, boy.
I mean, okay, so we'll keep it tight. We'll keep it tight. So I will say that even as an undergraduate, I felt drawn to two things: drawing on paper and video. Those were my twin stars. And you might think, well, what's the connective tissue there? And I would argue that all we have to do is look at the Paleolithic cave paintings to understand the connection between drawing and cinema. That it's the early line drawings, when activated by a flickering light, that come alive, become animated, become animate, that is the kind of historical connection. It's pretty hard to go further back than that, I must say. But that didn't occur to me, of course, until much later. And I've never been drawn to painting. I'm in awe of painters. I'm in awe of people who can manipulate oil to create these astonishing insights. But for me, there's something about the materiality of the tree that you are engaging with a piece of nature from the outset. You are mark making. And one thing that's been really fascinating that's happened over the years of engaging with digital technologies is I actually think it's altered my neuroanatomy. And I've spoken about this before, but pencils being the earliest, not the earliest language as a technology, but pencils are a technology, of course. And so the nakedness of the decision making when you're drawing on paper, you're really revealing your decisions, which I think for an artist anyway is a vulnerable thing to do. And in many cases, a generous one. It depends. But when I started working with emerging technologies, I started to see the paper not as a surface, but as infinite space from which forms I could tease out. And once I started working in VR, it really changed the way my drawings looked, and it still has. So it actually expanded my consciousness in a way that I think had I not worked that way, it might not have.
You definitely have this more like philosophical questions around media, which is very well appreciated, especially coming from our history. And the way that you describe animation almost ontologically, thinking back to Plato's Cave and thinking back to the mark making as a sort of bringing together all of these different fields of experience, I think that's brilliant.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, I do think that when I use the word transdisciplinary, what I really mean is all of that media, all of those different influences, those collaborations, those disciplines are enmeshed, imbricated together. They're not separate and distinct, that they are in and of themselves entangled.
Even literature, which is what I caught when I was reading about your film, The Quivering and Lively Nerves of the Now, which is inspired by Clarice Lispector's novel, which Clarice Lispector is one of my favorite writers of all time. She opened a world for me, and interestingly, I recently read a beautiful article making connections between her work and of the neo-concretistas in Brazil. Influenced by phenomenology, they start reconfiguring the relationship between the space of the spectator and the artwork through the line, precisely as you very well articulated. Tell us more about this relationship between literary elements and the world building and rebuilding aspects shared between these literary works and your virtual environments.
Oh, I could talk about Clarice too, like indefinitely. She was a huge influence on me. And actually, notably, I would add, when I first read her book, I put it down and I thought, oh my God. And I say this without any hubris or conceit. It was more of a connection. But I thought, oh, she writes the way I draw. There's a kind of animal, visceral way that she articulates her vision, or she calls it the fourth dimension. And I think it's no accident that she inspires actually a disproportionate number of digital artists. Several digital artists that I know and respect came to me and said, wait, we're obsessed with her too. She's amazing. And you could argue like, well, that's because she's just a giant. And she is so iconoclastic and in her own, she really has one of the most distinct voices I've ever heard. But for me, that was the point of departure. And yes, it is actually an ontological space that you're plunged into, where those boundaries dissolve. And I thought, if there were any way I could, in this particular video that I made, even come close to visualizing some of what I feel when I'm in it, I'm going to try. And I guess the other sort of element I would add to it is that as a woman, this Brazilian woman, the way that she expresses animal desire, carnal desire, flouts all of the conservative minoritarian rule here in the United States and the ways in which there are all these forces working against women or anybody who isn't essentially a white man in power, realizing their own desires, acknowledging, understanding their animal desires.
But it goes back to your idea of working in that restrictive space. I think there is a connection, of course, between her and Kafka. When you mentioned it earlier, I thought like, yeah, this is classic Cuban, make lemonade out of lemons. But something about the apparently constrictive space of the paper, even the idea of limiting boundaries that exist with drawing itself, invokes again this idea of the sort of infinite space within the constrictive space in a way.
I also want to build on that and say, as a mom, like, we're pretty crafty with our time.
Yes.
And so that is, as you were saying, a more restrictive space, because you do want to be present for your children. Like, the most heartbreaking thing is, Mom, you love your art more than you love me.
Yes.
And so you also had to manage that. I mean, I have one, you have three. So, like, all of these constrictions on your time and focus.
Yeah, I would say that is a really, I love that we're talking about this. This is something I rarely get to talk about, and it's something that I do think a lot about, but you've both articulated it so gorgeously. I do think that these moments of containment, these roadblocks, things that keep us from what we think we need to do, force a certain either problem solving, ingenuity, hacking, for lack of a better term. And that is the tension. And I think we could have a whole other conversation about the way artists who are also mothers are treated generally. I think it may be changing a little bit, but certainly when I was coming up, it was not something I ever wanted to talk about. If I ever talked about it, it was an immediate, I would just watch the eyes glaze over. Not that I was ever talking about my children per se, but the experience of motherhood, which, let's face it, is an animal experience. And I think, back to Carol Ann, this is funny, but I remember she came and I'd just done all these small, tiny drawings. I called them manifestos, and they were all abstract, of course, but they had a lot of energy packed into 9 by 12 inches. And she was asking me about them sort of generally, and she brought up motherhood, and I was very defensive. And I said, these have nothing to do with motherhood. This has nothing to do with it. And she said, au contraire, these have everything to do with motherhood. And I think that all that anguish and the contradiction and the simultaneity and all that implies of being more than one thing. I mean, this gets into almost like the tenets of quantum mechanics, but that all of those things being true at once yielded these fraught drawings. And she saw it clearly. And of course, I didn't.
Okay, I do want to touch on your drawings, because at your show at Charlie James Gallery here in LA, art critic Shayna Nyes Dambrot and I both had the same, like, we both attacked you in the same way. We're like, your relationship with your archive is fascinating, because all artists, we have just this pile of stuff that we don't know what to do with, and we're over it, and it's old, and it's not great, and it didn't work, and we don't want to throw it out, but we also don't want to keep it. It's like, it's a complex relationship with an archive, and you found a through point of using your archive, reconnecting with it, and making it into new work. Can you talk a little bit about that?
This is one way in which I do think of it as a data set, not to be overdetermined, but I think it is a data set. That is the grist. It is the thing that one can't get away from, as much as I might try. And I had a very influential drawing teacher in college as an undergraduate. His name is Mike Lear, an incredible draftsman. And I would make drawings and want to tear them up, and I would tear them up. And he would say, don't you dare. You hold on to that. That mistake, or that what you perceive as a failure, is your teacher. You will learn from it. Don't do it. And I gnashed my teeth, and it made me furious, but I eventually started to listen. And it pained me as a quasi-perfectionist to hold on to things that I felt ashamed of, let's put it that way, or I was embarrassed by. But over time, when I started back in 2014, 2015, I did start tearing them up. I realized they were actual material, and that by tearing them intentionally, and there's a violence to that too, let's be clear, that something, it's almost like part of this process of transmutation and transformation that so interests me in the translation from 2D to 3D to digital, analog to digital. I mean, you just saw this at Charlie James. I have a series of sculptures that are bespoke, that are made from my drawings, my 2D drawings that I have torn into, they look almost like leaves or feathers, and I arrange them in such a way, they end up looking sort of Baroque. But this is going to sound a little crazy and metaphysical, but I do believe that the energy that goes into the mark from the outset, and then of course gets torn and reconfigured as a 3D mark, which is of course how I think about my work in VR. These are 3D drawings, 3D marks, that there is something that is contained in the essential DNA of the mark making that emerges in the sculpture. And when we then take a further step, whether it's turning these into digital objects that then become the subjects of my films or videos, or most recently, when I project video onto them and they become this surface, they become reanimated again. So there's this iterative process that I think allows the lines and the intention behind the lines and all the energy behind the lines and the energy in the tear and the energy of the video and the animation to combine and commingle, as you were just saying, into a new entity, into a new embodied experience, and one that I hope can challenge consciousness. I think of these things all under the umbrella of expanded cinema, which is, of course, Gene Youngblood's term from his book of the same name. And one thing that's been surprising and exciting to me is, and I discovered this back in the pandemic, I couldn't access my studio, and I was just in my one-car garage with no window, so no light and really no air, which was not very healthy, is playing with projection on these sculptures illuminated for me the ways in which they refer back to AR, because they look disembodied, they look simulated, and of course they couldn't have been more physical or present. By the way, I don't think of AR or any digital media as immaterial. I know it's often listed that way. I don't think of it that way. I think it's every bit as material as something we would consider physical or concrete. But when we take something that we assume is one thing and turn it into something else, I just find it electrifying, and it makes me feel that it's not about like recycling to me. It's much more about sort of honoring what came before and understanding that it may have been inchoate. It may just not have been ready, and it may need to emerge as something else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that.
And I love this idea of the metamorphosis and the mutations. I mean, your whole getting into this relationship between motherhood and your work is incredibly fascinating. As an art historian, I see the connection with this larger tradition of eco-critical feminism, specifically because there is parallelism between how we understand motherhood traditionally and the creative artistic process. We think that motherhood ends with creation, which is a human being. That is the thing that is born, and then once it's born, that is what we focus on and what we celebrate and what we care. But similarly, there's this idea that the creative process ends once the creation is done. And the beauty of where there's no end or beginning, there's no conclusion, but it's more of this energy that you talk about. It's so fascinating to me, because it is almost as if we were the instruments of that energy rather than we were utilizing the energy to create something. So going back to this idea of the mutations, it is a sort of navigation through all of these different phases and fields and spaces where perhaps the original mark just continues on.
I love the way you frame that. I do think of it as a sort of ship of Theseus, that if we talk about, for example, some of my film work, we start with the 2D drawing, tear it up, turn it into a sculpture, use photogrammetry to translate it into a 3D digital object, which is both additive and subtractive. So the machine learning adds things and it also leaves things out. And that's sort of fascinating to me, because now we're talking about vision, language, other perspectives, Umwelts. Then bringing it into a 3D software where I can treat it in ways that I can't in this physical space. For example, I can use lighting that would be otherwise impossible. I can subject it to physics that are otherwise impossible. I can create environments that are purely speculative or imaginary. So it lives in that space. And then from there, because it is a frame-based system, which you understand acutely, when we identify a single frame and print it, then it's transformed again. So then what of the original line and drawing remains? And I would argue all of it.
I think of it as endless translations.
Yes.
It really all goes back to the idea that it is this endless act of translating. And when we think about translation as that act that continues, then there is neither original nor copy, right? There is a continuity where, don't get me wrong, like I'm not saying some form of genesis disappears or mutation is just repetition. There is all of that change as well, where some form of an original not necessarily disappears, but like you say, like just mutates and becomes some other object.
Totally. And that's where Baudrillard as an influence really is very present. And that's purely an undergraduate influence. It really landed with me then for reasons that, of course, you never understand until it reemerges. And a lot of these things are emergent. But I love that. Yeah. And it's my goal anyway is to offer, obviously intentionally and critically, but certain iterative perspectives that might illuminate the ways in which we can get away from a truly anthropocentric perspective and Umwelt. Well, how can we expand a vision or multiple visions of the natural world, or of not even a natural world, of a different type of consciousness, all of which sounds very amorphous and indeterminate. But one of the ways in which, as a species, we've gotten away from and we've become decoupled from our senses in the ways that we perceive and understand and move through the world is because we have cut those avenues off and not thought, not even empathically, not even exhibited curiosity about how other species that are more than human understand, experience the world. And of course, we can never really know because we have our own limitations. But even getting somewhere close to that seems to me a really fascinating pursuit.
I think that's a really nice moment to talk about augmented reality projects up at the Whitney. You have one up at the Hammer, and you're about to open or have just opened one at LACMA, Los Angeles Contemporary.
The Whitney project is ongoing. It's a permanent installation.
Yeah.
And if you want to experience it, you go to the 8th floor balcony. The Hammer actually is closed,
That's
but
done.
That was a future
That was
human.
amazing, yeah.
That was Corpus. And currently, yes, at LACMA, we've just opened Substrate, which I would love to talk about the social sculpture piece of augmented reality, the ways, again, back to this idea of inviting participation and inviting other voices into the conversation, rather than sort of coming in from on high and saying, this is how things are. Again, it gets right back to my roots, really, of like, what kind of magic happens when you ask someone what they think? You ask someone what moves them. What is it that is meaningful or impactful to them? Because obviously, once in a while, you're going to get, the equivalent of spam. But on balance, it's extraordinary what comes out of the human imaginary when invited into that discourse.
So the piece at the Whitney, you actually invite the audience to add to it.
Yes. So this piece at the Whitney is called Cento. And I think of corpus, which was this holobiont, which is to say a single organism made up of many different organisms, its own sort of body politic, that corpus really gave rise to Cento. Cento is an imaginary, transspeciated, ethically bioengineered future creature made of cephalopod, marine animal, serpent, mycelium, machine, and avian. It's also feathers. And we humans are excluded from its DNA other than our position of care, that we are invited into a relationship of care. It's presented as a creature that needs to survive the sixth extinction or somehow just survive ecocide. And we are invited to add feathers to its body, each feather of which has its own evolutionary properties that might ensure survival, metaphorically, of course. And so from a menu of 12 feathers that I drew, you can add whatever you want, and it appears in real time on Cento's body as it soars and flaps over the meatpacking district. And of course, it's fascinating. At Fourth Wall, we don't, because of a very strong anti-surveillance position I take, we only have analytics for what people add. And it is just amazing to see over the now years what people add, what their priorities are. And I, at some point, would love to just go through it and see, how does this track with what's happening geopolitically, what's happening nationally? Are there trends we can identify? And the same is true for Substrate, which just opened at LACMA. It'll take too long to describe everything other than to say that one thing that's really interesting to me, when we talk about systems thinking, I'm really interested in looking to nature, to biomimicry, to look at systems in nature that are equitable, that work, that are self-sustaining and distributive, in a moment where we have so many radical asymmetries that are harming so many people and other species, and of course the planet itself. So I'd also been thinking a lot about tree root systems and the ways in which mother trees in forests do distribute nutrients, care, communicate, and they also work, of course, with mycelial networks, the fungal colonies that support all carbon-based life, to ensure the health of the forest. And I thought, well, if we could translate into civic institutions, into civic systems, what if we considered 3 mother trees, a library, a community college, and an art museum, a public art museum, this being LACMA. And so the invitation to the audience, and this is part 2 of a project, by the way, this is the AR translation of that. So we invite the audience to submit a quote unquote spore, which is to say an artwork, an idea, a poem, a teacher, a song, a film, anything that had a profound impact on your life and why it's important to you as an act of cultural preservation, particularly in a moment of book banning, of histories being erased from national archives, of this entire campaign to neutralize centuries of artistic cultural products. And so how can we add those to this network and have it expand and grow and keep that as a living archive of what is important to people? In other words, not relying on a kind of top-down discussion of what is important, of course, because that's totally specious, as we've learned. But what if when you ask someone what mattered to you, they put it out, and then you, the viewer, it appears in real time, your spore, your contribution, your submission lives in the network, but you can also then scroll through and see what other people have added. Mm-hmm. And they are remarkable. They're remarkably moving.
Wait, how do we see this?
Well, you have to go to LACMA, and you have to download the latest version of the app, and you just basically open the app, you tap Substrate, and it walks you right through it. Yeah. But it's been so incredible because we're keeping an archive in the back end of what everybody submitted. And I'm going to hold on to this for a long time and share it with LACMA because this is a record of this moment in time. And it's amazing to see some people mention individuals, some people mention books. But I think because we're in a museum, we have a surfeit of artworks
that's a self-selecting.
Yeah, it's a
group.
Self-selecting. But we intend to install it at different libraries and also universities. So this is something we really want to grow as an archive, as a living archive.
I wanted to ask you, some years ago when I was in New York and I saw your piece at the Whitney, I was having dinner with a couple curators and they both said, oh my God, we love that piece. We love Nancy. Our museums could never do it. I was like, what are you talking about? And they said, we don't even have Wi-Fi. Like for us to go print something, we literally have to like walk over, plug into the printer and print it. So how much does technology infrastructure affect where your projects are?
That's an excellent question. I first of all just want to say for the record, I think it's a disgrace how little funding we have for these critical cultural institutions. And that goes for schools as well. But certainly for these museums and libraries most of all, honestly. It can be a real barrier. So I was so fortunate. At the Whitney, Christiana Paul, who curated this project and really stewarded it from the beginning, she, for many, many decades, has insisted on digital art and the place of digital art in the canon of art history. And she has an encyclopedic knowledge. She literally wrote the book on digital art. So there's a shorthand, obviously, I can speak with her as someone who really understands so much of this ecosystem. That was sort of built-in support. And actually, it was that year that they did the first Annenberg lecture. They invited me to give the Annenberg lecture. And it was the first time they'd ever invited a digital artist, which was an enormous privilege and honor. And so I think there's a slow shift toward acknowledging that this is legitimate. You know, it's always been sort of sidelined or siloed elsewhere.
But the Whitney's also a brand new building.
The Whitney is a brand new building.
So
I think with
infrastructure.
Certainly with other institutions and smaller institutions, I mean, we try to be as nimble and as accommodating as possible. So we try to work with what they have. And, you know, for example, when I did my retrospective at the Georgia Museum, you know, they had Wi-Fi and that was about it. They'd never done anything like this. But they were game, I was game, we found a way to do it. But I would say that it is a huge barrier in certain institutions, and not a lot of institutions have a dedicated IT person. So it all comes down to what are the resources that that institution has, and then how can I, as an artist, make it as frictionless for them as possible. But it's an ongoing struggle, and this is true not just for AR, it's certainly true for a lot of projected media. Anytime you're using a projector, you're dealing with any number of challenges. So, I mean, it's a whole thing. Now, I still think it's well worth doing, but it's certainly something that has to be taken into consideration.
there seems to be a sort of prejudice maybe towards digital art. It's always been there, but it never really entered the art history canon unless you're doing very specialized research on the history of tech art. But in terms of current political situation, specifically with funding and all of this, but more particularly around the relationship between digital technologies and resources, and the sort of extraction of resources and the high demand for this kind of natural resources that technology it's causing, and it's sort of staying out of sight. We're not very aware of what is happening, and it's, I think, a danger because it's so immaterial that we think it's fully immaterial and made just out of air. How do you think about that through your work?
I think it's an ongoing navigation, and it's something that I'm deeply concerned about. I think overall, we need a lot more digital literacy. And one of the things I always think about, whether it's in augmented reality or any discussion of machine learning, is who benefits, who's harmed, who is profiting. I don't know if you've read Techno-Feudalism. I highly recommend it to your listeners, or Psychopolitics by Byung-Chul Han. I mean, there's this way in which we willingly, because we aren't aware, we don't know all the myriad ways we are being surveilled, extracted, for profit. We are literally enriching a few people at our own expense. I mean, we could talk, first of all, about manufacturing. Let's just talk for a second about hardware. The impact of using our phones, of our iPhones and any other device like that, any mobile device, is disproportionately absorbed by the most abusive labor practices in the global south. There is an entire part of the world that is essentially forced to support this need, this hunger, this production pipeline.
I know mining, it's a big one.
Huge. That's it.
Yeah.
So that's deeply problematic from the jump. Then, if we're going to get into the sort of machine learning piece of it, the data centers themselves obviously require enormous amounts of water to cool the gazillions of GPUs and everything else. And I just saw something the other day, like residents who have lived in a place for however many years, and then one of these data centers comes, there are real concrete pollutants that are leaching into their water supplies. I mean, it's a whole thing. And so as someone who works with a lot of these tools, I think I would say that machine learning, I've worked with it in certain very specific and discrete contexts, but it isn't my primary interest per se. I certainly know a lot of artists who do, where that is their primary interest. And a lot of them are very articulate about this and have said really beautiful things about how it's how you use it. What do you do with that tool once you have it in your hands? And if you're using it blithely and in an uncritical way and sort of, oh, well, I don't see it, so I don't see the impact, so like, what does it matter? That is irresponsible at best and unforgivable at worst. On the other hand, I think when we talk about a research-based practice, I try to read as much as possible about, again, who is benefiting from these things, and then how can we open up conversations to increase that literacy and to call out these infractions and just increase awareness about usage and raise questions about these different social harms, ecological harms, et cetera. At least that's been my focus, I would say, as an artist. And at the same time, to really recognize what of these technologies does work, what does have potential, what can open up conversation. Like, again, if we think of it as social sculpture, how could that have, if not a net good, how could it neutralize some of the harms? And I don't know. I mean, I think that's a really thorny, irresolvable question right now.
I wanted to actually tie that in because you're about to move back to the East Coast and you're going to be teaching, but not art students.
Yes. So I'm so fortunate I have lots of conflicted feelings about moving, which I probably shouldn't talk about or I'll start sobbing. But I have the great fortune, I was invited to co-teach a class on drawing at the engineering school at NYU with another awesome digital artist named Carla Ganis, who also has a robust drawing practice. So when we just started mind melding about it, it was, one of those like, where you can't get enough breath because you're and then we could do this and we could do this and we could do this. But I think it offers an incredible opportunity to really explode and expand what we talk about, what drawing means, what is line, like to ask really essential questions. What is mark making? And take it outside of any traditional practice and really invite truly alternative angles that are unexpected. And of course, we're going to invite them to draw in VR because that itself is just such a mind-bending. There's a wonderful writer named Zay Amesbury, and he talks about it as ontological vertigo. How can you induce that feeling while encouraging all of the questions that drawing raises in terms of trace, in terms of decision making, in terms of embodiment, in terms of storytelling, in terms of representation. Like, there are so many things that we can get into if we think about it outside of any predictable or traditional bounds.
That's fascinating. I'm seeing just so many connections between the work that we do, but I'm writing a lot about the relationship between art and science in terms of like the episteme. When we visualize the universe, there is a line drawing happening, right? Because we need a graphic representation of that space, which is really not structure space. I was just fascinated the other day. I was reading where we're at in terms of cosmological scientific paradigms, and like right now we're back at thinking that the universe is flat, and I'm like, oh, look at us, we're back to flatness. How does that happen? But at least all the theories are always implicitly understanding that we have this human optics, that we're looking from a certain perspective. It will probably be incredibly fascinating to see how coming from a scientific, technical field informs their thinking about line and drawing.
Yeah, and you just made me realize, like, I think the thing that appeals so much to me about some of the principles of quantum mechanics, the little of which I really understand and grok in any really profound way, is the thing that troubles any assumption of anything binary or anything that is fixed, flat, this idea of dimensionality. I just read an incredible graphic novel, they prefer you call it a comic, called Unflattening. Unflattening, I recommend it to everybody. Talk about like line and dimension. And what about the fourth dimension? What about all of these, I mean, the incredible hubris that a human could ever understand. I mean, anything really about existence or spatial understanding is so we just stab at it, we just push at it, we try and kick those tires. And one of the things I'm doing a lot in my work now, whether it's in film and working with filmic collage, I'm very inspired by Len Lai. How can 2 things, 3 things, 4 things, 5 things be true at once? And how can you present those in a way that doesn't feel totally chaotic, but also, you know, I have these collages that I'm working with right now that are flat. I'd call them maybe the bas relief. Like, there's just the most bas relief you get. But how can I create the illusion of space by juxtaposing a kind of organic biomorphic line with something much more hard and pixelated? And what might that engender, and how might that trouble your experience as a human in metabolizing that, in understanding it? And could it be irresolvable? Could there be an irresolvable logic that's built in? Because it's, I mean, that's how it is to me. I feel like everything is mediated and hyper-mediated,
yes,
algorithmically mediated now.
Yes.
And so how can we call out that influence and also understand the ways in which we metabolize it without knowing?
I think unflattening the irresolvable is a perfect way to end the episode.
Oh, that's great.
Oh, thank you so much. We always have one last question.
Yes, we do. This is a question that we bring back for each guest, where we invite you to be as expansive and unflat as you want. It's very open-ended, but here's the question. What project would you do if you had unlimited funding and time? And we invite you to be as cosmic as you want.
I actually have 2. But I would say the thing they have in common is scale. So I would want to do this at sort of a mega scale. The first is something that I've actually already have a few renderings made of this. And it is both architectural and immersive. This is a very hackneyed word, immersive. But it is a 3D sculptural installation that I would love to take up all of Mass Mocha or something, really do it at scale. It comes directly from my Distortions collage series, where you would literally be moving through pixelated space, and it would be a kinetic sculpture, but that you would have a sense of what it might feel like to be inside of a computer, as I imagine it. I am not claiming any scientific accuracy, which is my birthright as an artist. We could just imagine these things. And then the other thing I would love to do is I really want to push the projection mapping onto my slipstream sculptures at scale. So I'd really love to do them in a way that could be public and on this like facade of a whole building, and have that be something that I hope would evoke some kind of not just wonder and awe, but consideration of some of the questions that we're talking about now and how we understand and perceive and experience some of this expanded cinema.
Oh my God, amazing. I want to see both of those. I want to see all of it.
Amazing.
Oh my gosh. It was so great to have you on the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was so fun.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for being with us today and for this wonderful outpouring of all the interesting aspects of your artistic practice.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I can't. I have a reading list now. I can't wait. Okay, so we're going to wrap up with some thank yous. Thank you to our wonderful producers, Sky Park Tausig, Taras Matla at the University of Maryland Art Gallery, and Jonathan Furmansky for letting us use your music.
Thank you again to our listeners and to Nancy Baker Cahill for speaking with us today. We will be back in 2 weeks with a new episode here on The Art Equation.
Bye.
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 We are The Art Equation. You can find us wherever you listen every other Thursday.
Thanks for being here with us. We'd really love to hear your thoughts. So please subscribe. And if you have a moment to leave a review, it really helps us out. We love the feedback. Talk to you soon here on The Art Equation. The Art Equation is a podcast from Now Be Here with support from the University of Maryland Art Gallery. Now Be Here is a directory and resource created by and for women and non-binary artists. You can find more information at www.nowbehereart.com.
Wait, can we do that again? Because that was just so high pitch. I absolutely hate that. I was going to start singing like songs or something.
It's the musical episode. Did you miss that?